Light and colors are vibrations received by the eye. Sound is vibration received by the ear or by a microphone. The recording process is very much like painting. The palette with which we have to work is the whole world of musical and non-musical sounds. Microphones are the brushes with which we gather these vibrations. This program explores ways to alter the hues of sound colors, add texture, depth, and contrast to the picture that we're painting for our mind's ear. Signal processing allows us to take basic sounds and shape and blend them to create depth and texture. Signal processing is sculpturing sound in space. In Madison Avenue terms, it's the secret sauce of music and sound mixing. In fact, if there's any single thing that makes a master recording different from a demo, it's the creative use of the right signal processing. There are 4 basic building blocks to signal processing. Each block represents many different types of devices, and each modifies the sound differently. The 4 basic blocks are equalizers, variable gain amplifiers, delays, and reverb devices. In most cases, a certain sound is created by connecting together 2 or more of the blocks in a certain way. By manipulating and altering the basic building blocks of sound sculpture, you're able to create the textural depths and subtleties which contribute to a master quality recording. Equalization and variable gain are inline devices which work best when all the signal passes through them. Or put another way, the only signal which is heard is the one that is passing through the processor. Delay and reverb should be added to the direct signal as sidechain effects. The output of the unaffected direct signal is blended with the output of the processor. Equalization is basically a tone control. By filtering or enhancing different frequency ranges, equalization can change the timbre of a sound. It can enhance or diminish any of the overtones that a sound might have, such as harmonics and subharmonics. It changes the hues of the colors. Variable gain amplifiers, or VGAs, modify the dynamic range of the loud to soft of a sound. VGAs include limiters, compressors, noise gates, and expanders. They can make a loud sound less loud, or they can make unwanted quiet sounds disappear. They can reduce the attack of a sound and accelerate its decay, or they can increase the attack of a sound and make it more percussive. VGAs alter the density of the sound and affect the contrast of the affected color. Delay devices store sound for a certain amount of time. Delay alters time and creates reflection. Delay can change time relationships, provide thickness, reinforce notes, or create phase cancellation. It can also expand or contract real time through time modulation. Reverb devices create space. They create the illusion of a room by replicating the way sound would bounce and reverberate in a real interior space. Reverb brings sound to life. It gives the impression of power, adds drama, size, and depth. In recent years, it's become possible to make master quality recording in Lilliputian home studios. Probably the most significant factor in this revolution has been the emergence in 1978 of digital signal processing, and then the proliferation of sophisticated low-cost signal processing devices. Really, they are computer-controlled magic black boxes that let each programming magician bring their own sound vision to life. All of these devices do their magic by shaping and manipulating audio signals. But before we start to explore those possibilities, let's review the nature of an audio signal and how it's created. Everything in nature is made up of vibrations, waves, periodicity, and all wave phenomenon follow basically the same rules. As waves move out from their point of origin, their energy is dissipated. When they strike something, they reflect and cause interference with subsequent waves. Sound is a pressure wave, an undulating sphere of changing atmospheric pressure, moving out in all directions from a vibrating source. If some point is described as a relaxed, neutral position, a wave will have a positive excursion or compression of the atmosphere and a negative excursion or rarefaction of the atmosphere. When the wave strikes a sensitive surface, like the diaphragm inside of a human ear or the diaphragm inside of a microphone, the fluctuations in atmospheric pressure create a corresponding vibration in the diaphragm. The microphone uses the vibration of the diaphragm to create a fluctuating electronic signal. Right now, you're looking at the signal produced by my voice. Once amplified, that signal can be used to vibrate the diaphragm of a speaker, which in turn creates the atmospheric pressure waves that we hear as sound. Reality sound is definitely not a simple wave, but for the sake of description, that's what we'll be using. This is a sine wave. We have a signal generator hooked up to an oscilloscope, and we can both see and hear the tone. The frequency of the signal is the number of complete cycles that occur in a given amount of time. This is usually described as cycles per second. As the cycles per second increase, so does the pitch. A wavelength is the physical space occupied by one complete cycle. On Earth, sound travels about 1,100 feet per second, with some variation depending on altitude and temperature. So, this 1,000 cycle tone has a wavelength of little over 1 foot in reality space. Here on the scope, that wavelength is compressed so that we can observe it. The amplitude of the wave is how loud it is. Basically, the higher the wave goes above or below the median, the louder the signal will be. In the case of acoustic power, it is the amount of sound pressure variation above or below the prevailing atmospheric pressure. In the case of an electronic signal, it is so many volts above or below the median voltage. Now, the average median voltage, or ground plane of an electronic circuit, is halfway between the positive peaks and the negative peaks. When the signal rises above the median, the speaker cone is pushed outward, and when it goes below the median, the speaker cone is pulled inward. Zero level is a point which the designers of a system, for instance a console or tape recorder, have chosen as the average maximum operating level of the system, though allowances have been made for occasional signals of greater magnitude. The strength of the signal is measured in decibels, a unit of sound measurement, above or below this average operating level. The dB unit is always measured in comparison to some reference level. For instance, 0 dB SPL, sound pressure level, is the threshold of hearing for the average person. A loud rock band will be between 100 and 125 dB SPL, and the studio that we're in is at about 10 dB SPL. Level meters are reference to a certain level of signal into a specific resistance. The most common average operating levels are minus 10 dB or plus 4 dB. In correctly designed contemporary equipment, a minus 10 system will provide equal quality to a plus 4 system. Headroom is the dynamic range between the average operating level of a system and the level at which severe distortion will take place. Clipping is what happens when the loudest peaks of the signal bump against the ceiling of the amplifier. The peaks are flattened or distorted. Remember that any change in the signal as it goes through the amplifier or through the signal processing devices could be considered distortion. Good distortion, that's when you like it. Bad distortion, oh, that's when you don't. Because one man's music, well, it's another man's noise. Now I'd like to introduce you to the 4 signal processing devices we'll use to create most of the effects and sounds you'll hear on this tape. Our equalizer is an Orban Model 642 parametric equalizer. Our variable gain amplifier is a DBX 166 compressor limiter noise gate. Our delay is a vintage MXR. And our reverb is an ART DR1. Now these are all outboard processors. Inboard processors are those built right into the board. A lot of boards have basic to very elaborate EQ built right into them. And the near future will probably bring us many more types of digital processing built right into the board. There's a lot of good equipment out there to choose from, but often a piece of equipment will have lots of knobs, light up like a Christmas tree, and have oodles of settings, none of which sound any good. It's how it sounds that matters, not how many whistles and bells it might have. Outboard effects, like the ones we'll be using, are usually plugged into a circuit for specific needs. Though it may be easier, it's not a very good idea to set up your system so that your effects are continually in the signal path. Connect them through a patch bay so that you can add them as you need them. That way, you have to make a conscious decision about which of them you want to use. It's also quieter that way. If you keep your effects continually hooked up the same way, you'll find yourself repeating the same patterns. Going through a gated reverb period, for example, or a heavy echo delay period, instead of choosing the best effect for each new sound. If you don't have them always hooked up, you'll connect them differently, depending on what you're trying to achieve. For instance, the reverb might come before the equalizer and the delay before the reverb for one session, but the order could be completely reversed for the next session. Which elements you use and how you hook them up will vary with what you hear in your head. Remember, as you hook these devices up, to follow the logic of the signal path. The output of one device is always hooked up to the input of another device. And the average operating levels of the devices you hook up, they should match. If they don't, if for instance you're trying to connect a +4 processor into a -10 board, you'll need to use a level matching amplifier between them. Now, real-time digital processors such as this unit and this unit use extremely fast, high-speed circuits that generate lots of heat. If high-tech signal processors are not well ventilated, they will tend to get noisy, they'll lose their programs, and if they get too hot, well, they'll simply blow up. So if you're using conventional racks, provide adequate ventilation space between each of the devices, and it's also a good idea to mount a small fan in the back. Oh, and by the way, they don't like smoke very much either. The film that smoke leaves behind changes the performance of the microprocessor circuitry. Although most outboard gear is rack mountable, there are lots of stomp boxes out there, guitar pedals, that could be considered outboard equipment. Most of them are a little bit too noisy to be used for recording, but the quality of this gear is improving, and some of it can be used as though it were rack-mounted outboard gear. If you do use a stomp box and don't want it to sound like you're driving a taxi cab, make sure it's running off a power supply or is using brand new batteries. Another trick you might try is to creatively use an outboard DBX noise reduction system. Encode the signal before it goes into the stomp box and decode the output. The question always comes up, do you process the signal before or after you record it? I think you want to create or capture the sound as close as you can to the way you want it to sound in the final sonic panorama. So add it as you record. Signal processing in past years was a little reverb and later some tape delay. As such, it was always added later, after the fact, usually in the mixdown. Part of the fear of adding signal processing during the actual recording process was based on the high cost of going back into the studio and having to re-record the part. Now, if you own your own gear, these kinds of fears become less of a problem because it's easy to go back and re-record something if you find that you've added a little too much of this or that. The advantage is that you're able to hear the sound in context, and much like it'll sound in the final mix. After all, when your mind's ear hears a certain snare sound, you don't hear the snare and then 3 weeks later hear the reverb. The reverb is integrated with the sound of the instrument. It's impossible to say where the instrument sound ends and the effect begins. So it's better to shape the sound and the effect together. Besides, if you wait until mixdown to add processing to some key track, you may find that the space for that effect has already been filled with an overdub. Now, the other thing is that if you have a minimum amount of signal processing gear, one of each of the 4 basic building blocks, for example, and you wait to add them until you mix down, what ends up happening is that your overall mix will have a sameness of texture and lack definition and clarity. If you add a certain amount of reverb and delay as you go, you're able to increase the overall complexity of your sound. You can make it sound as though you have more processing tools, and most importantly, cater each effect to the particular sound that you're recording. Now, these days, more and more people realize that signal processing is an integral part of today's sound, and therefore they add that secret sauce as they go. We've completed our introduction to the 4 basic building blocks of signal processing. All of them work by shaping or combining audio signals. Equalizers and variable gain amplifiers selectively shape the amplitude of a signal and should be placed directly in the signal path. Delay and reverb devices recombine a processed signal with its source and should be placed in the side chain of the signal path. You should set these devices up so that they can be used flexibly in varying sequences and combinations. They can be used during the recording process, again when combining tracks, and during the final mix to shape the overall sound. Now let's take a detailed look at 2 of the basic building blocks of signal processing: equalization and variable gain amplifiers. Reverb and delay will be covered in the next volume of this series. To EQ or not to EQ? Now, that's a question. I've heard someone say on more than one occasion, "Oh, I don't record with EQ," or "I never use EQ." Well, that's nonsense. Even if the board has no EQ, the instrument or its amplifier has some adjusting tone control. The studio acoustics change the tone, so does the type of microphone as well as the board's amplifier designs. And the recorder has EQ. And the speakers, well, they have EQ too. So does the room you're listening in. On top of all that, our ears are definitely not flat. Their response changes under different loudnesses and conditions, both acoustic and physical. So don't be afraid to use EQ when needed. One of the biggest problems most people have when they're working with an equalizer is that they'll boost the high frequency to get more clarity. But boosting the highs doesn't really solve the problem of why a sound is muddy, or remove the low-end rumble, you know, the woo that exists in most rooms. The way to approach EQ is not solely as an additive process, but also as a subtractive one. When you take away the frequencies which you don't want, all that you're left with is that which you want. Now that's sort of a Zen approach to recording, but by subtracting what's not essential, you're making room for the essential sounds of the other instruments. Think of EQ in terms of filling a gallon pail of sound. If the bottom of the pail is loaded with a lot of murky rumble on voice tracks or other superfluous sounds from a big bottom acoustic guitar, for instance, you won't have a lot of room for anything else. Use EQ to open space for the essential elements of each overlapping sound texture. For instance, a full-range acoustic guitar will cause the bass guitar to lose distinctness. By rolling off the low end of the guitar, the clarity of the bass will be improved. The guitar may sound somewhat thin by itself, but inside the mix, nothing will seem to be missing. Your brain will fill in the non-essential missing parts, and those instruments that need low frequency will retain their clarity. Another reason to use cut EQ is to avoid emphasizing the inevitable distortion that all equalizers introduce. Equalizers use frequency-dependent phase cancellation to selectively boost or cut a particular frequency range. Depending on how this phase shift is handled, it can seem almost as though the sound passing through the EQ is also being phased or flanged. As you increase the amount of equalization, This effect is accentuated and can be most unpleasant with a poorly designed equalizer. There are several different types of equalizers, and they are described in terms of their EQ curves. An EQ curve describes the frequency versus loudness pattern of a particular equalizer. EQ curves fall into a few basic groups. Roll-off filters reduce the amplitude of all sounds beyond a selectable frequency point. The amount of reduction increases linearly beyond that point. Low-frequency and high-frequency cut filters, like rumble or hiss filters, usually operate with a roll-off curve.
Listen to the change in this broadband sound as we roll off the high end.
Most high-frequency boost or cut equalizers in consoles are of a shelf variety. Unlike the curve of a roll-off equalizer, a shelving equalizer will stabilize or flatten out at a certain point.
Now we'll apply cut EQ to the same broadband sound. You can see that it levels off at about 1,000 cycles.
A peaking or dipping equalizer creates a bell-shaped curve in the sound's frequency response. The boost or cut is centered at a certain frequency, but will affect a range of frequencies to both sides of the center frequency. A bell-shaped EQ pattern is commonly called a pass band.
Now, listen as we dip out a band centered at 1,000 cycles.
The bandwidth of the pass band is the frequency range at 3 dB above or below the flat response. Bell-shaped curves around the same center frequency can have varying degrees of bandwidth, going from very narrow to very broad. On some EQs, the bandwidth is adjustable, but on most, it's fixed. The relationship of the center frequency to the bandwidth is called Q. For example, in this case, the center frequency is 1,000 cycles. If the bandwidth is 500 cycles, the Q will be 1,000 divided by 500, or 2. For a given center frequency, the narrower the bandwidth, the higher the Q. An extremely narrow band EQ, a Q of 100 plus or so, is called a notch filter because it dips out a very narrow range or a notch of frequencies. For instance, a notch filter is useful when dipping 60-cycle hum or any other well-defined fixed frequency, such as film camera noise. Remember, Q is independent of amplitude. Whether you turn it up a little or a lot, the Q of the filter remains constant. Slope is the angle of boost or cut an equalizer will deliver over a 1-octave range. A sharp slope will have a greater number of dB per octave than a gentler slope of a few dB per octave. Slope is usually not adjustable in board EQ, however, it does change with variable bandwidth. The simplest equalizer has a fixed single frequency, but you can vary the amount of attenuation or boost. Many small boards have simple 2-band equalizers with a few selectable frequencies for each boost or cut control. Graphic equalizers have the ability to boost or cut at specific frequencies. Most of them operate across the complete audio spectrum, but some will encompass a smaller range. Graphic equalizers have a certain number of controls or bands per octave, which means that the frequency intervals between controls is wider as the frequency goes up. Contrary to popular belief, the position of the graphic equalizer controls does not give a true visual indication of the frequency response curve of the EQ. Because each of the bands is, by design, very narrow, in order to selectively control only its range, the frequency response curve will have sharp dips between each of the band control settings. Though the position of the controls might indicate a gentle curve, the electronics are introducing hills and valleys. Graphics tend to be the least usable for recording, but they're very popular for room tuning of PA and studio monitors. I also use them to equalize the signal that I'm sending to a reverb device. I guess in a sense, I'm tuning the room that the reverb represents. Can I tell my joke now? Well, there was this musician. He walks into this music store, goes up to the guy who's selling PA products, says, listen, I got 9 guys in the band and I want to get an equalizer for my PA. Guy says, I'm sorry, buddy, you'll have to get another player. All we have is 10 band equalizers.
Parametric equalizers, like those found in most consoles, allow you to continuously boost or cut a sweepable frequency band within a range. For example, plus 10 to minus 10 dB. There may be 2, 3, and up to 6 overlapping frequency ranges.
For example, this Orban parametric has 4. The low range on this equalizer is tunable from 20 Hertz to 500 Hertz. The low mid-range from about 80 Hertz to 1600 Hertz. The mid-range from about 250 Hertz to over 6300 Hertz. And the high range from about 1000 Hertz to 20,000 Hertz. Here we're using the mid-range on our parametric EQ to dip out a band centered at about 250 Hertz. And then using the sweep control to move the center frequency up to about 6,000 Hertz.
Many equalizers, such as this one, use concentric controls for each range. The Orban has the knobs that control the boost or cut sitting on top of the ones that control the amount of bandwidth, or Q.
A true parametric equalizer also has an adjustable bandwidth, or Q, for each of its frequency ranges. Many console equalizers lack this adjustment and really should be called pseudo-parametric.
We've seen that there are several basic types of EQ curves: roll-off EQ, shelf EQ, and peak and dip EQ, defined in terms of bandwidth and variable Q. We've also looked at several basic types of equalizer devices: the fixed frequency equalizer, the graphic equalizer, and the parametric equalizer. And we've examined the importance of using EQ subtractively to open up space for the essential elements of each overlapping sound.
There are a few basic guidelines for adjusting the tonality. For example, you can't bring out tones that just don't exist. If you want a real sparkly sound, you must use a bright microphone to record it with. If the high frequencies aren't captured by the mic, or if the guitar strings are old and lifeless, there'll be nothing there for the EQ to boost. When recording, I try to get the sound as close to what I want to hear from the instrument or the amp's tone control. For sounds in space, organic sounds, the type of microphone and where it's placed in the environment will also create part of the sound of the instrument. I then add EQ as seasoning and record it the way I think it will fit in the mix. I'll generally record it a bit brighter than I think it should be because you tend to lose a slight amount of brilliance through the course of the recording process. Then when I remix, I use what additional EQ is needed to get the overlapping textures that I'm looking for. Let's start with the guitar. Generally, you'll want to begin EQing the low end of each sound and work toward the high end of that sound. One of the biggest problems with recording at home is low-end rumble caused by air conditioning, external noise, and structural vibration. Always roll off the non-essential low end. Generally, that's 60 Hertz and below. It'll make your tracks have a lot more clarity and cut down on that deep woof and rumble which seems to plague so many home recordings. In other words, as I mentioned earlier, go for the impression or the essence of each sound, not the entire body or its substance. Many times, the best way to find the frequency area that you're looking for is to turn the boost control up full and sweep it through its range of frequencies until you find the frequency that seems to be the most pleasing to you, or those you want to diminish. Then set the boost or cut to the desired amount. In many cases, when you find the frequency that is most appealing to you, you'll find that it's in what we call the presence range, which extends between 1,500 and 5,000 cycles. If you emphasize that range with a lot of EQ, your mix will sound very mid-rangey and won't seem to have the broadband clarity and richness that you're looking for. So what I often do is find the fundamental tone that I prefer, then move the frequency of the equalizer up slightly. This brings out the basic tone, as well as the upper harmonics and overtone colors of the sound. For example, if the frequency I like best is around 4,000 cycles, I'll bring the frequency setting of the equalizer up to 5,000 or 5,500 cycles. The result will be a fuller texture with more clarity. It'll also make the sound seem to be less electronic. It's important to bring out an instrument's overtones when you're mixing, because it's generally the overtones and harmonics which give that instrument its particular unique coloration and definition. Always be sure that you're making the sound better, not just different or louder. Take the EQ in and out and listen to the difference. Try to establish a comparison or reference so you know what the EQ is doing. Now, let's add the electric guitar and bass. The acoustic guitar sounded thin by itself, but now it fits right into the overall sound panorama. We've looked at a few basic guidelines for adjusting tonality. Start with a mic that's sensitive to the tonal range you're trying to capture. Roll off non-essential low end. Then turn up the boost cut control and sweep the equalizer through its range until you find the frequency you want to emphasize or diminish. When you locate the fundamental tone of an instrument, it's a good idea to set the equalizer to a slightly higher frequency so as to boost the overtones and harmonics as well as the basic tone. Go for the essence and leave space for the other instruments to fill. As soon as you are using more than one microphone at a time, you've got to be aware that the EQ on a mic affects the EQ of any and all the instruments that mic picks up. Let's use drums, for example. I've heard of people who go into the studio and they solo the snare and they spend hours getting a sound on the snare mic. That's a waste of time, because as soon as you turn on the overhead microphones and all the other drum mics, the overall sound of the snare will change because these mics are also picking up varying amounts of snare. Always work with equalization in total rather than in isolation. For instance, on a hi-hat, I tend to roll off everything below 1,000 cycles and boost highs like crazy above 10,000 cycles. I do this because I'm using very little of the hi-hat microphone per se. Since the overheads pick up plenty of hi-hat, all I want from the hi-hat microphone is that really close percussive sound that comes from the stick impact. The close mic provides specific direction, attack, clarity, and definition, while the overhead provides the overall sound of the hi-hat as it relates to the rest of the drums. The hi-hat microphone all by itself might sound extremely thin, but within the overall mix of the entire set, it will sound correct, unclouded, and vibrant.
let's say you're in a live situation and you're attempting to equalize a set of drums. If there is a bass amp or a loud stage monitor cranking right next to the drummer, you'll find that you're also equalizing the leakage from the bass. The bass sound in the total mix will be radically changed by what is done to the drums, and the drums will have very little clarity and definition. I now have the drum overhead mic in solo. Listen to the leakage from the bass as I change the EQ on the overheads. EQ not only alters the sound of the drums, but also affects the leakage from the bass.
So move the bass amp, or have the drummer work with headphones instead of monitors. In almost all recordings, there will be a certain amount of EQ interaction and overlapping sound coloration. Another thing to watch for is the effect of EQ on headroom of the amplifiers.
When equalization is added, the headroom of the EQ's amplifier is reduced in the boosted frequency range. To prevent this, turn down the signal going into the equalizer, thus gaining more headroom for the EQ amplifier in the boosted range.
If you're mixing, use the input trim to turn down the signal coming from the tape recorder. If the board doesn't have an input trim for the tape signal, turn down the tape recorder's playback. The EQ'd signal will be cleaner and have less distortion. Finally, let's look at the procedure to follow with EQing during mixdown. Start with the most basic rhythm instruments and build to the most featured sounds.
For instance, start with bass, drums, and guitar. Then add secondary embellishment instruments, such as horns and string parts. Then solo instruments, background vocals, and finally, lead vocals. As you bring up each instrument, adjust its EQ in solo, but then release the solo and hear how it sounds in relationship to the sounds which have been previously EQ'd.
It is important to keep in mind the fact that EQ is interactive, and the EQ of any one sound can affect the perceived EQ as well as the clarity and distinctness of any other sound in the composition.
When working with EQ, remember that signals overlap and interact. So always work with EQ in totality, rather than adjusting the EQ for each mic in soloed isolation. When you're boosting a frequency range, turn down the equalizer's input to give the output more headroom. And in the mix, adjust the EQ of the basic rhythm tracks first and build toward the featured sound.
Variable gain amplifiers alter the dynamic range of an instrument, voice, or other sound. Returning to visual imagery, it's like controlling the density of a colored light.
Most amplifiers are described as having unity gain with a proportionate amount of output for a certain amount of input signal. The ratio between input and output is 1:1, a straight line. You can see that as the input signal rises in amplitude, the output signal increases to the same degree.
Compressors, limiters, noise gates, and expanders are all variable gain amplifiers. A variable gain amplifier is like an automatic volume control that raises and lowers the amplifier's gain depending on how loud or quiet the signal coming into it might be. Its input-output gain ratio is changed by a circuit that involves a level sensor at the amplifier's input.
In the case of the compressor limiter, if the signal exceeds the threshold by going above the sensor's setting, the gain goes down. The compressor limiter's output will continue to go up, but not at so great a rate as the input signal. As we raise the input level, you can see the output level of the compressor goes up at a much gentler rate. In the case of an expander or gate, when the input drops below the threshold, the gain goes down. In other words, that which is quiet gets even quieter. Watch what happens as we lower the level of this signal. At a certain level, the output of the gate will drop dramatically.
A compressor limiter lowers the bridge, while a gate expander lowers the river. Now, all these devices allow you to reshape the envelope of a musical sound. An envelope is a time versus loudness curve of any given sound. Any sound.
Here is a typical example. If this were a bass, T1 would be the pluck of the string. For a snare, it would be the instant the snare is struck. From T1 to T2 is the attack of the sound, and T2 is called the transient, or leading edge of the wave. The sustain would be from T2 to T3, though a snare would have almost no sustain. T3 would be the release point, and from T3 to T4 is the decay. Some sounds have lower, but significant, secondary attacks and beats in their sustain. Others have dynamic flutter in their decay.
A variable gain amplifier allows us to modify the dynamics or the loudness elements of the envelope. For example, the pluck of the bass string is significantly louder than the sustain, release, or decay. The bass player, and for that matter everyone else in the control room, says, "Hey man, can you put a compressor on the bass so we can get more sustain?" What they're actually asking for is, can you put a compressor on this so that the pluck will be less loud, and then we'll be able to turn up the overall average level and hear more sustain in relationship to the pluck. Although I've never known a bass player say it exactly that way. Shaping the sound envelope allows us to choose the part of the sound that we want to emphasize.
We've seen that all variable gain amplifiers selectively affect the dynamics of a signal. Compressors and limiters make loud sounds less loud, while expanders and noise gates make quiet sounds disappear. They are all used to shape the envelope, or time versus loudness curve, of an input signal. They can be used to selectively modify the attack, sustain, or decay of any note.
In working with a compressor, you shape the sound envelope by adjusting several variables.
The sensitivity of the device, the point at which gain reduction occurs, is controlled by adjusting the input or threshold control. When the input signal rises above the threshold, gain is reduced. The threshold pivot point on the input versus output curve is called the knee.
The second factor that will determine the amount of gain reduction is the ratio. Ratio defines the severity of the dynamic change which will occur when the signal exceeds the threshold.
Let's say the signal goes above the threshold by 2 dB. If the output goes up by 1 dB, that's a ratio of 2 to 1. That's fairly gentle. The output does go up, but not at quite so great a rate as the input signal. A compressor's ratio can go from 2 to 1 to about 6 or 7 to 1. At a ratio of around 8 or 10 to 1, the device becomes more of a limiter than a compressor.
Basically, the difference between a compressor and a limiter is that compressors have gentler ratios, while limiters have more severe ratios. Generally, for music recording, you won't use limiting ratios because you don't want to severely restrict the dynamics. You just want to compress them some. Ratios of 50 to 1 or 100 to 1 are used for such things as PAs, to prevent speakers from being overdriven and blown out. The actual amount of gain reduction on a compressor is determined by the combination of ratio and threshold setting.
If the ratio and the threshold are set high, only the very loudest peaks will be affected. But once the threshold has been exceeded, the output will increase very little, even if the peak is very loud. On the other hand, if the threshold is set low and the ratio is gentle, 2 or 3 to 1, gain reduction will occur most of the time, but the dynamics will not be grossly affected. Some compressor limiters have 2 knees. The first is set for a lower threshold and a gentler ratio, and the second has a higher threshold and ratio. What happens is that gentle compression will occur most of the time, and the highest peaks will be limited. A few small compressor limiters, called over-easies, have variable knees that gradually increase the ratio as the signal rises above the threshold. Basically, the louder the input signal above the threshold, the higher the ratio of gain reduction.
One of the more popular over-easies has 1 input, 1 output, and 1 slider that says more. That's my kind of outboard gear. Simple.
One more variable. For many VGAs, there is a limit to how much compression or limiting you can have. This limit defines the range of the device. Once the compressor reaches that amount of reduction, the output will increase at the same rate as the input level until the rest of the circuit runs out of headroom and clips.
For an example of using a compressor, let's look in more detail at that bass player who wanted more sustain. I've already set the average operating level for the bass. Now I'll add the compressor. I'll adjust the input threshold until the meter's responding to the attack of the bass. Now I'm going to adjust the ratio control. With a low threshold and a high ratio, you can hear that the peaks are compressed right out of existence. So I'm going to raise the threshold and lower the ratio until I get the sound exactly the way I want it. Now there's more sustain in relationship to the pluck, or the attack of the sound. I'm going to hit the solo so we can hear a comparison between the compressed sound and the uncompressed sound. Listen to the difference. Now at the end of it all is the output control, which raises or lowers the average level after the signal has been dynamically altered. Instead of moving any of the board's controls, most engineers will adjust the variable gain amplifier's output control for the best level back into the console. An interesting aside. Sometimes a bass player will ask why he needs a compressor when he's running direct into the board, but he doesn't seem to need one when he's playing live. The answer is that the bass amp speaker acts as a compressor. A bass speaker is very large and has a great deal of mass. When the pluck occurs, the speaker is unable to respond to the instantaneous pluck and rounds off the transient. The mass of the speaker slows the cone's acceleration and compresses the pluck. So the bass speaker itself acts as an acoustic compressor. Now let's look at expanders and gates. When the input signal drops below the threshold, an expander or gate will automatically turn down or off. An expander, for instance, might be used to accelerate a gradual decaying reverb.
This diagram shows an expander set to a ratio of 1 to 2. If the input signal goes below the threshold by 1 dB, the output will go down by 2 dB. A noise gate is essentially an expander with a very high ratio. For a gate, you might have a ratio of 1 to 100.
For instance, let's say that you've got a snare track and there's a lot of low-level leakage between every snare drum beat from the hi-hat or other nearby instruments. You can set the gate to turn the signal off immediately after each snare drum beat. So when the drum is struck, the gate instantaneously turns on, and the sound of the snare drum passes on through. As the snare rattles away into leakage, the decay goes below the threshold and the amplifier turns off. The result is the leakage is eliminated between every beat of the snare drum. Now, many engineer producers, perhaps as many as 2 or 3 billion, use noise gates on snares, toms, and kick drums. An expander will do the same thing, but it turns its amplifier off more gradually. Some expander gates have a range control which establishes a floor to the degree of expansion or gating. In other words, when gain reduction occurs, the output level will drop only so far. For example, sometimes when you're gating a snare, you won't want to turn the leakage completely off, but just dip it lower than it already is. The range control adjusts the loudness of the fully expanded or gated signal.
The performance of all VGAs is defined by several variables. The threshold is the level at which the gain reduction begins to occur. Compressors and limiters turn down the gain when the input signal goes over the threshold. Expanders and gates turn down the gain on the signal when the input goes below the threshold. The ratio determines the amount of gain reduction that will occur when a signal passes the threshold. Limiters and noise gates have a very severe ratio that reduces the signal's gain nearly completely, while compressors and expanders have more gentle ratios. The range of a VGA defines the outer limits of its effectiveness, and on some expanders and gates, this limit is adjustable. A VGA should be inserted in the signal path after the instrument's average operating level has been set from the channel's input all the way to the recorder. After setting threshold, ratio, and other variables to achieve the effect you want, adjust the output level that goes back into the board.
Two additional variables you often have to work with are attack and release time. The attack time is roughly how fast the amplifier reduces its gain in the case of a compressor or limiter, or how fast it turns back on in the case of the expander or gate. Now, having a variable attack time on a compressor allows you to adjust how much of the transient will pass before the gain reduction occurs. This is important because the transient, or leading edge of a sound, is crucial to our ability to identify and localize that sound. If you eliminate it completely, there will be a problem of definition and clarity. The recording will sound lifeless and dull and have little attack or percussiveness. Variable attack time can be used to allow the entire transient to pass before gain reduction occurs.
For instance, if you want lots of attack from a rock and roll piano and not a lot of sustain, set a slow attack time so that the transient of the hammers striking the strings will completely pass before the gain comes down on the following sustain. Another useful example would be if you had a kick drum with no punch. By setting a slow attack and a reasonably low threshold, when the beater hits the head, the transient of the hit will pass before the gain comes down. This reduces the floppy overtones of the drum. The result gives the kick drum a tightness with substantially more attack and percussiveness. I often use this technique on drum machine-generated kick drum and snare sounds, which in general are dynamically restricted.
The release time in a compressor or limiter is how fast the amplifier returns to normal gain when the input signal has fallen below the threshold. You might want a very fast release time if, for instance, you have a rock and roll singer who only stretches his vocal cords on an occasional passage and sings the next syllable at a much lower level. On the other hand, let's say you're recording bass and the bass player is playing a lot of long legato notes. In that case, you want a slow release time so the gain of the amplifier will come back up as the natural sustain of the bass falls away, thus increasing the sustain. When using a compressor or limiter, we usually want the release time to coincide with the beginning of the next event's envelope. A sort of pumping or breathing will be heard after each peak if the release time is too short on any sound that is periodic, dynamic, and heavily compressed. Lengthening the release time will make the gain recovery less apparent. But don't go too far. If the release time is too long, compression will be occurring continuously and possibly only coloring the sound and not dynamically altering the gain per se. In the case of a noise gate or expander, the attack time controls how fast the amplifier will turn back on when the input signal exceeds the threshold.
Normally, a gate or expander must have a very fast attack time so that it turns on at the leading edge of every transient. But a very unique sound can be created by setting the attack time to allow the entire transient to pass before the gate opens on the remaining sustain. A bass without a transient has no pluck, and the sound created has almost a bowed quality to it.
The release time on a gate is how fast the amplifier will turn off after a loud signal has occurred.
For instance, you would want a fairly fast release time if you were trying to gate out leakage on the snare mic. However, if the release time was extremely fast, the snare would have almost no rattle. In fact, the sound would almost resemble a timbale. On the other hand, if you have something like a Leslie cabinet or a reverb, where the decay flutters and gets louder and then softer as it falls away, a very fast release time will cause the gate to rapidly turn itself on and then off. A fairly slow release time will let the entire fluttering signal fall past the threshold point before it actually releases. In the case of something which has a very quick decay, you can live with a much faster release time. We've seen that adjustment of attack and release time can radically affect how a VGA affects a signal. Attack time determines how quickly a compressor or limiter reduces its gain when the input signal exceeds the threshold, or how quickly an expander or gate turns back on when the input signal exceeds the threshold. Using a slow attack time on a compressor will emphasize the transient or attack of a sound, while a slow attack time on a gate can eliminate the transient completely. Release time determines how quickly a VGA returns to normal gain when the input no longer exceeds the threshold. With both compressors and gates, your setting of release time will depend on the rate of decay of the input signal.
Let's look in some more detail at the process of putting a variable gain amplifier in the signal path. A compressor is generally set up so that only one signal goes through it. You wouldn't put a kick drum and a bass or other unrelated combinations of sounds through the same unit. You might smooth out an entire string or brass section with a single compressor, but usually one sound through one compressor is the rule. The same principle applies to gates. If you're using a gate on a single track, it's safer to use it in remix because you don't have to worry about having it correctly set while recording. If the gate sensitivity is set wrong while recording, there's no way to go back and fix it.
However, gates are frequently used while recording drums. If you do need to record with gates in the signal path, be sure they're turning on and off correctly. A compressor limiter is usually inserted or connected between the microphone preamp and the fader or EQ input. This patch point is called the access, the send and receive, or insert point. This board has its access, send, and receive connected to a normaled patch bay. Since the compressor limiters alter the dynamics, plugging them into the circuit before you set the mic preamp trim could cause you to overload the microphone preamp and you wouldn't even know it. So before you plug in your compressor limiter, adjust the gain through the entire signal path all the way to the recorder. The mic preamp should be set for a conservative peak level between -1 and +1 dB on the record meters. Once this normal signal level has been adjusted, you can then insert the compressor limiter. Connect the preamp out or access out to the compressor limiter input. If you have a normal patch bay, the compressor input can be connected without interrupting the normal signal path. Only when you plug in the compressor limiter output to the return in will the normal be broken and the insertion completed. So, before connecting the output of the compressor into the signal path or access return, roughly adjust the compression so that the level of the signal won't suddenly jump 200 dB and blow everybody's heads off. Most compressor limiters will have gain reduction indicators or meters. Roughly set the ratio control for the severity of compression you think you'll need. Adjust the threshold until you see a certain amount of gain reduction occurring on peaks, as indicated by the meter. How quickly the meter responds to the transient gives indication of the attack time. How quickly it returns to its normal level is a good indication of the release time. Now, turn down the output control of the compressor and connect the output to the access return. And then turn up the output gain. Raise it until the record level reads about ±1 dB VU on the average for most of the peaks. Now you can fine-tune the various adjustments to your ears. By doing it this way, you interrupt the signal very slightly and you avoid smoking anyone's head. If someone is singing while you're hooking it up, for instance, their voice won't be interrupted except for that slight amount of time when the limiter compressor's output is turned down and then turned back up. Keep in mind that raising or lowering the microphone trim will affect the compressor's threshold. Raising the fader, however, will simply change the average output level from the compressor limiter and not affect any of the gain reduction performance. Because the preamp sees the signal before the compressor limiter reduces the peaks, anytime you change the sound, for instance going from one voice to two voices or changing the patches on a synthesizer, always pull the compressor out of the normal circuit and readjust the preamp gain. Then connect the compressor back in. Some compressors have a bypass switch. When you're through making the adjustments, you simply put it back in the circuit. Also, throughout the course of recording, keep checking your meters to make sure that the amount of compression that you originally started with is still appropriate. In fact, it will probably change. When the red light goes on, everybody plays louder once they start hearing themselves and pumping up, getting into the groove. Consequently, you will probably need to turn down the microphone preamplifier trim so that the compression stays about the same as when you originally set it up.
When you are combining several microphones to a single track, such as when recording a horn or string section. Mix the individual channels to a single bus. Connect the output of that bus to the input of the compressor and the output of the compressor to the input of the tape recorder.
When you're compressing an entire bus, if you change anything before the compressor's input, such as individual levels, EQ, or a microphone trim, you will change how much compression is occurring to the overall program.
First, listen to how the balance changes without a compressor.
The trombone just gets louder.
But with the compressor in the line, if you turn up the trombone, the trumpet's gain comes down as a result of the trombone's louder input level. Now, this may or may not be what you want, but it's important to know that it's happening.
We've seen that some general rules apply to placing variable gain amplifiers in the signal path. You normally put one signal through one unit, unless you're recording a horn or string section. It's usually patched between the microphone preamp and the fader, after adjustments of level throughout the signal path. The VGA's level and other settings can be roughly adjusted before patching the output to the access return and completing the insertion. If any further adjustments are made in the signal path before the VGA, the performance of the VGA will be affected and readjustments will be necessary.
While recording, when combining toms with overheads, you'll frequently need to use gates on the toms to tighten up the overall sound. This eliminates the constant rumble that most toms seem to have in sympathy to the kick and snare drums. To do this, you put one gate on each of the tom mics. The gate threshold has to be sensitive enough to turn on when each of the drums is individually struck, but not so sensitive that it turns on if any of the other drums are struck.
Let's start with the high tom. I've got the high tom mic fed through a gate, and I'm raising the threshold until all the other drums fall below the threshold and disappear as the gate kicks in.
Now, some gates have variable release times. Others give you a choice between one or two different times. This one has a fast release time and a slow release time. We're going to use the slow release time. The release time is set to the desired decay before overring, rumble, or the intrusion of snare or kick drum leakage.
Now, let's repeat the process on the low tom. The low tom mic is fed through a separate gate, and once again, I'm raising the threshold until only that one drum passes through the gate.
Through the whole session, be sure that you keep checking back to make sure the gates don't open if the wrong drum is struck. This will cause erratic leakage and a constant changing of the overall drum sound. Also, check that they do open when the appropriate drum is struck. Otherwise, they'll seem to come and go and be picked up only by the overheads. If you have only one or two tracks for drums, you'll also need to use gates while recording on the kick and snare. Getting all the threshold and release settings just right is a little tricky, but not impossible, and it dramatically tightens up the overall drum sound. Gates are also very useful on drum machines to clean up low-level clocking noises, which frequently occur. These are little, radio frequency, high squealy, buzzy burpy sounds that occur between every one of the drum beats. And by using a gate, you can eliminate it. You can hear how much cleaner it sounds. An access patch point between the threshold detector and the variable gain amplifier provides opportunities to use the compressor limiter in many other ways. For instance, a few compressor limiters have elaborate built-in parametric equalizers. This provides frequency-dependent variable gain control. But a similar effect can be attained by placing an equalizer in the side chain of the threshold detector. This allows the compressor limiter to become more or less sensitive to certain frequency ranges. De-essers, or sibilance controllers, are one example of a frequency-dependent compressor. They're used to control juicy vocalists with percussive S's and T's and P's. Compression occurs during these high-frequency peaks, and when lower frequency peaks occur, they are ignored. I've also found de-essers useful for smoothing out a harsh hi-hat or cymbal sound. This is particularly true with sampled hi-hat sounds found in drum machines. Understand that for most frequency-dependent compressor limiter circuits, when the high frequency is present and reduction occurs, other frequencies will also be lowered. One or two very expensive units use elaborate processing circuitry to keep all the other frequencies at normal level while only compressing those selected frequencies. But for most other units, that is a problem. Expanders and gates can also be frequency-dependent or externally controlled. Most of them have what they call an external or key input.
This is useful, for instance, when using a gate on a kick drum if the kick drum track happens to have a lot of snare leakage, or vice versa. The leakage makes the gate open on the snare as well as on the kick beat. Attempting to EQ out the leakage before the signal goes to the gate makes the kick drum sound terrible. The solution is to use the kick's external key input, which is controlled by an EQ'd kick signal. Let the kick track go through the gate as it normally would, but also feed it to an equalizer. Set this equalizer to boost the kick drum attack frequencies and at the same time to tune out any sounds related to the snare.
This signal will sound terrible, but since it isn't heard, it doesn't matter. The output of the equalizer is connected to the key input, which controls the kick drum's gate.
The result is the gate opens on only the kick drum, and the kick drum's EQ can be adjusted for the best sound for the kick drum without any regard to the leakage from the snare.
There are many other tricks to the trade that can utilize externally triggered gates. Let's say the bad news is you have a bass player who thinks she has to play every note she knows in every bar. Ms. Busy Fingers. The good news is that the drummer has a solid foot on the kick drum. As Carl Malden would say, what do you do? Well, first you wait till everyone has gone home, then you run the bass through the gate.
Set the range control so the bass is heard all the time. But when the gate opens, it gets a little louder by 3 or 4 dB. Without interrupting the normal kick drum signal, connect the output of the kick drum to the external key-in of the bass's gate, so that even though Jocko 2 is playing zillions of notes, those that occur with the kick drum are emphasized.
Obviously, it'd be better if they played the part correctly, but sometimes fixing it's the only thing you can do. Another high-tech trick is to take pink or white noise, like this, and have it trigger on with the kick drum or snare. By mixing this burst of noise with the snare or kick, we've made the drum sound more electronic in nature. The exception to the one sound or texture to each gain modifier would be for certain types of stereo applications. For instance, stereo compression is frequently used during mastering. Stereo compressors are also useful if a particularly wide dynamic program is being transferred to a less dynamic medium, such as from a master 2-track to a cassette. A stereo compressor limiter has two separate signal paths with interlocking threshold circuitry. Often they can be joined by simply pushing a button like this. Earlier you saw just my voice on the left channel. Now my voice is making both channels operate. So what does all that stuff mean? Well, if it's necessary to compress a stereo signal, you might think you could use two identically adjusted similar units. Unfortunately, if compression's called for on one side, but not the other, the center of the stereo image will move toward the unaffected side during the compressed passage. The side that was not compressed would be slightly louder.
We're running this low-frequency tone through two identical compressors which are capable of being interlocked stereophonically. When I trigger a loud tom-tom to occur on the left side, the left output is reduced. If you're listening in stereo, the tone, or any center channel program, will appear to shift to the right. Now I'm turning on the stereo interlock. Both meters are reduced by the same amount when I strike the tom, and the center doesn't shift.
Compressor limiters shouldn't be used for the sole purpose of getting a hotter average level. Some engineers do use them for that reason, but getting a hotter level at the expense of compressing away your dynamics leaves you with recordings that have no contrast. Most good engineers use compressor limiters for sculpturing the envelope by changing specific dynamics of a sound. The compressor limiter can be an artistic tool, much like musical instruments, when they're used properly.
Although there are no rules for ratio settings, I usually use low compression ratios, say 2:1, 3:1, or 4:1, for lead vocals, solos, and other instruments which I feel should have wider dynamic range. For pad sounds like rhythm guitars, background vocals, oohs and ahs in the verse, and harmony parts in the chorus, for instance, I'll use higher ratios of 4:1, 5:1, or 6:1, so that the dynamics of these sounds change very little in the mix and lay evenly throughout the whole track.
A final word of caution. Variable gain amplifiers will always color the sound to some degree. No matter how fast a circuit is, reality's faster. So you always lose a certain amount of transient response. This is more often a problem in the case of expanders and gates, which have to open on the very leading edge of the attacking transient. I usually connect an equalizer before the gate, and then I boost the highs to offset the coloration the gate will introduce. Now, all that being said, I seldom use a gate to simply remove noise or dead sections of track. They tint the sound too much for my taste. I'd much rather use board muting or simply erase away the noise that's left behind between chorus parts or solos. This always gives me the least amount of change to the sound and retains the most transparency. And there's no lingering sounds of coughs or counting, finger noises, giggling, or sniffing.
1, 2, 3, 4.
We've looked at a number of specific applications of variable gain amplifiers. Gates can be used to clean up the sound of tom-toms and other drums. De-essers can be used to eliminate percussive vocal sounds. The key input of a gate can be used to make the gate respond to specific frequencies or to make one signal trigger another. A stereo compressor can help keep a stereo signal well balanced. Used to excess, however, VGAs can flatten or distort your sound, but used properly, they can be a valuable artistic tool.
You've now been introduced to two of the building blocks of signal processing, equalizers and variable gain amplifiers. In the next program of this series, we're going to look in detail at the other two basic building blocks, delay and reverb. Meanwhile, you should have plenty to experiment with. Remember that you can use signal processing when you record, mix down, or combine tracks. You can hook processors up in hundreds of sequences and combinations. None of them are right or wrong. The important thing is pleasing yourself. You should consider signal processors as musical instruments, and the effects they create as an integral part of the total sound.
Exchange tapes and information with other people. That's how you learn. And you should never stop listening to what you're hearing.